March the 2nd, 1879. Richmond, London. The gas lamps along Park Road hissed faintly that evening, their glow struggling against the fog that rolled in from the Thames. The air was heavy with the scent of damp brick and coal smoke, and the sound of carriage wheels echoed like a heartbeat through the narrow streets. Richmond was quiet, too quiet for a Sunday night. But behind the calm surface of that respectable neighborhood, something unspeakable was about to happen. Julia Martha Thomas, a widow in her mid-50s, had returned home from the evening service at the local Presbyterian chapel. She was known in the parish as a woman of habit, polite, religious, though not especially well liked. People said she could be particular, even fussy, about her household affairs. Her small two-story house, Vine Cottages, stood on the edge of a lane that sloped down toward the river. To the casual passerby, it was unremarkable, a modest home for a woman of modest means. But to Julia, it was a symbol of her independence, the last thing she could truly call her own. Inside, a single candle burned in the parlor, throwing long flickering shadows on the floral wallpaper. In the kitchen, a pot of water simmered on the stove. And upstairs, in the servants' small room beneath the eaves, lay a woman whose very presence in that house had been a mistake from the beginning. Her name was Kate Webster. No one in Richmond really knew where Kate came from. Some said she was Irish, others claimed she had worked in several households across London, dismissed each time for theft or insolence. Her references, when she arrived at Vine Cottages in January, had seemed questionable at best. But Julia Thomas, perhaps out of loneliness or misplaced charity, had hired her anyway. The arrangement had soured almost immediately. Julia, accustomed to order and propriety, was appalled by Kate's slovenly manners, her coarse speech, the way she handled the china with greasy hands. Kate, in turn, despised her employer's primness and sharp tongue. The two women lived under the same roof, but seemed to inhabit entirely different worlds. One striving for gentility, the other clinging to survival. By late February, Julia had decided to let her servant go. She mentioned to a friend from church that she could no longer tolerate that woman. The dismissal was to take effect at the end of the week, but fate, or something darker, intervened before then. That Sunday began like any other. Julia, dressed in her black gown, pinned her brooch, and left for evening service. Kate stayed behind, tending half-heartedly to the fire. Neighbours later recalled seeing smoke from the chimney and hearing clattering from inside, as if furniture was being moved. One neighbour, Mrs. Ives, even claimed she heard the faint sound of laughter, low, harsh, and unfamiliar. When Julia returned from church around 9 o'clock, she found the house dimly lit and unusually silent. The air felt heavy, thick with the smell of burnt fat and something metallic beneath it. She called out for Kate, but received no answer. She removed her gloves, hung up her cloak, and stepped into the parlor. The door to the kitchen stood slightly ajar. What happened next would never be fully known. Later, under interrogation, Kate would offer several contradictory versions. In one, Julia had scolded her violently, threatening to call the police over missing items. In another, the quarrel had turned physical, Kate claiming she pushed the older woman in self-defense. But what is certain is this. At some point that evening, Julia Martha Thomas was struck, perhaps with a flat iron, perhaps with bare hands, and fell to the floor of her kitchen. The fall was fatal. Or maybe it wasn't. Some accounts suggested that Julia was still breathing when the blows continued. Either way, the silence that followed was absolute. Kate stood over the body, her chest heaving, her face glistening with sweat. For a long while she didn't move. Then, methodically, she locked the kitchen door, shuttered the window, and stoked the fire higher. The flames roared to life, their glow painting her face an infernal orange. Down the lane, a constable on his rounds passed by the house. He would later recall smelling something strange, something like roasting meat, but he thought little of it. Inside, Kate Webster had begun her terrible work. She dragged the widow's body toward the scullery, muttering under her breath. The floorboards creaked beneath the weight. Using a carving knife and a small saw she found in the cupboard, she began to dismember the corpse. Arms first, then legs. The head came last. It was not a quick process. The air grew thick with smoke and the iron tang of blood. Every sound, the crack of bone, the scrape of steel, seemed to echo endlessly in that little house. By midnight, the once neat kitchen was unrecognizable. The floor was slick, the table overturned, and the pot on the stove now contained something unholy. Kate worked feverishly, as if driven by something beyond reason. She boiled portions of the remains to strip the flesh, packed others into a wooden box, and stuffed the smaller bones into drawers and cupboards. No one in the neighborhood noticed her leave around dawn, carrying a heavy bag. She walked down to the Thames, her boots leaving dark impressions in the frost. At the edge of the river, near Barnes Bridge, she paused. The tide was high, the water whispering softly beneath the fog. She heaved the bag into the current and watched it sink. It would not be the last time she returned to that river. Back at Vine Cottages, she cleaned as best she could. She scrubbed the floor, wiped the walls, even washed the kitchen knives. But some stains she discovered could not be erased. A smear on the skirting board, a dark patch in the grain of the wood. The house seemed to hold its breath around her. Then, as dawn broke over, Richmond, a strange idea took hold in her mind, an idea both audacious and grotesque. If Julia Thomas was gone, who would know? Who would come looking? Kate opened the widow's wardrobe and ran her fingers over the fine dresses, the jewellery, the hat with its black feathers. She smiled. By afternoon, she had transformed herself. Dressed in Julia's morning clothes, she stood before the mirror and practiced her voice. Higher, more delicate, more refined. When she walked down the lane that day, neighbours tipped their hats, believing they saw Mrs. Thomas herself. And when one woman asked if her servant girl had left already, Kate simply nodded and said, "Yes, she's gone. Good riddance." That night, the fire in Vine Cottages burned again. But this time, no one smelled meat, or heard laughter, or saw the flicker through the window. The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock. Days would pass before anyone began to ask questions. But by then, Kate Webster had already taken the first steps in a deception that would horrify London and become one of the most grotesque murder cases in Victorian history. And as the river carried its silent burden downstream, the fog closed in once more over Richmond, as if to hide what it had witnessed. Because sometimes, in places like this, respectable, quiet, unremarkable, the worst monsters wear human faces. And that night, March 2nd, 1879, a widow's house became a slaughterhouse. By the following week, the residents of Richmond began to notice that Mrs. Thomas had not been seen. Her neighbours, the Ives family, mentioned it first. They'd grown used to seeing her every Sunday walking back from the chapel, clutching her prayer book, and nodding stiffly at passers-by. Now her blinds remained drawn. The postman knocked twice but received no answer. Yet curiously, smoke still rose from the chimney, and someone was seen moving behind the curtains. The woman who appeared there looked, at a glance, like Mrs. Thomas. Same morning dress, same black hat, but her gait was different, heavier. And her face, pale, with coarse hands that did not belong to a lady of her station, lingered a moment too long in the window before disappearing from sight. Kate Webster had moved fully into the role of her murdered employer. She stayed in Vine Cottages as if it were her own, eating from Julia's cupboards, sleeping in her bed, and wearing her clothes. Her Irish accent softened to something genteel, almost theatrical. When a neighbour asked after the servant girl, she said simply that Kate had gone to Ireland and that she, Mrs. Thomas, was preparing to rent the property. It was a clever deceit, on the surface, but it could not hold. Kate was impulsive, reckless. Her arrogance soon betrayed her. She began selling Julia's furniture, claiming she needed money for travel. She pawned the widow's jewellery in Hammersmith. She even invited an acquaintance, a man named John Church, to help her let out the house, telling him she was the landlady herself. When Church entered Vine Cottages, he found the rooms curiously bare and the air stale, thick with the odour of disinfectant and smoke. Kate avoided the kitchen, steering him quickly away from it. The curtains there had been taken down, perhaps burned. Still, in the dim light of that February afternoon, the man saw what looked like a faint brown stain near the baseboard, and a lock of dark hair caught between two floorboards. He didn't ask about it. People didn't question much in those days, especially not a woman who spoke confidently and smiled like she had nothing to hide. But as Kate continued her charade, something in her began to unravel. At night, she claimed to hear noises, soft, wet sounds from the scullery, a faint tapping at the wall. The clock in the parlour, which had stopped the night of the murder, now seemed to tick again in irregular bursts, as if mocking her. She dreamed of the river, cold, endless, whispering her name. Sometimes she'd wake and swear she could smell boiling fat, even though the stove was unlit. Guilt, or madness, or something older than both. One evening, she ventured back toward Barnesbridge with another parcel. This time, she meant to be rid of the last traces. The head, perhaps, or the bones she could not burn. The fog was so thick she could barely see a few feet ahead. The water lapped quietly, reflecting the lantern light in trembling ribbons. She tossed the bundle into the current and watched it drift away, sinking slowly into the blackness. A boy fishing near the embankment later claimed he saw her. A lady, he said, in black with a sack. She was whispering to the river. No one believed him. Not then. Meanwhile, whispers spread through the parish. Mrs. Thomas, the widow of Vine Cottages, had gone away suddenly. But to where? Her pew at the chapel sat empty, her letters unanswered. Even the milkman said she'd stopped taking her deliveries. 2 weeks passed before concern hardened into suspicion. On March 24th, a woman named Mrs. Porter came to inquire about renting Mrs. Thomas's house. She had heard, through gossip, that the widow was seeking tenants. When she arrived, she was greeted by Kate herself, dressed impeccably in black silk. "I'm Mrs. Thomas," Kate said, offering tea. But her hands were rough, her nails dirty. Her eyes darted to the window whenever a carriage passed. Mrs. Porter left the house unsettled. Later, when police circulated a description of the suspect, She would remember the odd tension in that parlour, the faint smell of smoke, and something like decay seeping from the floorboards. By early April, Kate had overplayed her hand. Her impersonation faltered under the weight of her own greed. She began boasting in taverns of an inheritance, flashing coins and jewellery that clearly weren't hers. And soon, word reached the ears of someone who actually knew the real Julia Martha Thomas, a local tradesman named Mr. Menhennick. When he met Kate, still pretending to be the widow, he was struck by her accent and her crude manner. "You're not Mrs. Thomas," he told her flatly. For the first time, Kate faltered. She stammered something about illness, about having had a spell that changed her voice. But Menhennick didn't believe her. That night, he told the police, the constables visited Vine Cottages the following day. They found it empty. Kate had fled. Inside, the rooms were stripped bare. The walls smelled of lime and soot. In the scullery, beneath a loose floorboard, they found scraps of charred cloth and a fragment of human bone, blackened and brittle. The fireplace contained ash that was unusually thick, greasy, and clotted with small white chips. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Then, as one pried open the drain behind the house, the smell that rose from it confirmed what none of them dared to speak aloud. Human remains had been burned there. The news spread quickly. "Horrible discovery in Richmond," blared the headlines of the Illustrated Police News. Crowds gathered outside Vine Cottages, whispering, crossing themselves, staring at the small, ordinary house that had hidden something monstrous. But the murderer, Kate Webster, was gone. She had vanished from London, last seen boarding a train bound for Liverpool. From there, she was rumoured to have taken a ship bound for Ireland, carrying little more than a black bag and the jewellery she had stolen from the woman she butchered. The Thames, meanwhile, began to give up its secrets. On a grey afternoon in early May, a group of boys playing near Barnes Bridge spotted something floating in the reeds. At first, they thought it was a dead animal. But when one of them prodded it with a stick, it turned, revealing a human foot. Police were called immediately. They dragged the river for days, finding fragments, a piece of a leg, part of a rib cage, what might have been a shoulder, but no head. The papers called it the Richmond Horror. Londoners were fascinated and appalled in equal measure. Victorian society, obsessed with respectability and moral order, could hardly imagine such savagery taking place in a genteel suburb. And yet here it was. Proof that evil did not lurk only in the rookeries of Whitechapel, but behind the curtains of quiet homes. Weeks later, a reward was posted for the capture of Kate Webster, wanted for the willful murder and dismemberment of Mrs. Julia Martha Thomas. Descriptions were circulated to every port in Britain and Ireland, and still she managed to hide, until fate once again turned on her. Because the river had not finished speaking, and soon it would give back something far more damning than bones. The Thames, it seemed, could not keep its secrets forever. By June of 1879, the search for Kate Webster had reached a fever pitch. Handbills with her likeness were posted across London, Dublin, and Liverpool. 1,000 faces in 1,000 crowds were scrutinized for traces of her. The sharp jawline, the heavy brow, the restless eyes that betrayed guilt and cunning in equal measure. And yet, she might have escaped entirely, had it not been for an act of pure chance, or perhaps something darker guiding her downfall. In the coastal town of Kilcounty, Wexford, Ireland, an innkeeper's wife noticed a stranger lodging nearby. a woman who called herself Mrs. Thomas. She claimed to have returned home to see her family and said her husband, now deceased, had left her a small inheritance. But her story shifted each time she told it. One day she was from Dublin, another day from London, and her hands were coarse, chapped, and oddly scarred, as if from long hours of scrubbing something that refused to come clean. The woman's cousin, a fisherman who'd once worked near Richmond, happened to glance at an old newspaper brought in by travellers. The front page bore a sketch. Murderess wanted. The Richmond atrocity. He froze. The likeness was unmistakable. Within days, constables descended on the cottage where she stayed. It was early morning. Mist rolled over the Irish fields, soft and pale when they broke down the door. Kate Webster was at the hearth, packing her few belongings into a satchel. She turned, startled but defiant. For a brief second she tried to laugh it off, said it was all a misunderstanding, that she was being mistaken for another woman. But the look in her eyes betrayed the truth. They found in her possession several of Mrs. Thomas's items, a brooch, a gold watch, and a set of keys engraved with the initials J.M. and a T. She was arrested on June 28, 1879, and brought to London in irons aboard a steamer across the Irish Sea. The newspapers followed every step of her return. The Richmond murderess captured at last, read the Times. Crowds gathered at every station she passed, jeering, craning their necks for a glimpse of the woman who had boiled another human being in her own kitchen. When she was finally taken to the Richmond police station, she was silent. The officers remarked on her composure, the cold steadiness in her gaze, the lack of remorse. But that calm would soon crack under the relentless grind of an interrogation. At first, Kate denied everything. She said Mrs. Thomas had gone abroad. She said she herself had been given the house and possessions as a gift. Then, when confronted with evidence, the pawnbroker's receipts, the bloodstains, the witness statements, her story shifted again. She wept. She raged. She swore that she had been provoked. And then she told a version of events that chilled even the most hardened detectives. She claimed that on the night of March 2nd, Julia Thomas had returned home from church in a fit of temper. The two quarrelled over wages, over disrespect, over something petty that now seemed irrelevant. Julia, she said, had lunged at her. Kate pushed back harder than she intended. The older woman fell, down the narrow stairs, striking her head. She was dead within moments. That was her first lie. Because when the coroner's men later examined what was left of Julia Thomas's remains, they found marks that told another story. Deep cuts made deliberately, with precision. Still, the question that haunted the investigators was why. Why go beyond murder to such grotesque mutilation? Kate said she had panicked. She feared discovery, dismissal, ruin. I had no one to turn to, she murmured in her cell. No one in all of London. And yet her behaviour after the act, the impersonation, the selling of furniture, the calculated deceit, spoke not of panic, but of a terrible confidence. The public followed every sordid detail. The murder became a macabre obsession. The press dubbed her the Richmond monster. Cartoonists sketched her face in papers sold by the thousands. And outside the courtroom, crowds pressed so tightly that constables had to form barricades. Her trial opened on July 2nd, 1879, at the Old Bailey. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, society ladies, commoners, all craning for a glimpse of the woman who had turned domestic service into something infernal. Kate stood in the dock, pale and expressionless. When the indictment was read, she merely nodded. The prosecution was ruthless. They presented the sequence of her deception, the pawned jewelry, the burned fragments found in the fireplace, and, most damningly, the discovery of human remains confirmed to be that of a woman of Julia's age and stature. Witness after witness came forward. The pawnbroker, the neighbour who'd heard strange noises, the acquaintance who saw her dressed in Mrs. Thomas's clothes. Each detail, each testimony, painted the same portrait. A servant consumed by greed, resentment, and something unfathomably cruel. But the most haunting moment came when the coroner's report was read aloud. Inside the courtroom, silence fell. The jurors leaned forward. The report described in stark, clinical terms how the body had been dismembered, how the head was missing, how the flesh had been boiled. The words hung in the air like the tolling of a bell. Kate's composure broke at last. She covered her face and began to shake, not with sorrow, but fury. "It's all lies," she shouted. "You want to hang me for being poor?" The judge ordered her removed until she calmed herself. Outside, the streets buzzed with morbid fascination. In every pub and drawing room, Londoners debated the case. Was she mad, possessed, or simply evil beyond comprehension? But even as the trial continued, the River Thames, that silent witness, had not yet revealed everything. On the fourth day of proceedings, a constable entered the Ash courtroom with a message. A skull had been found. Workmen excavating near the newly built drainage system in Twickenham had uncovered a human head buried shallowly in the earth. It was small, the jaw slightly crooked, and the hair, though matted, still clung to the scalp. Forensic science of the era was primitive, but the match was unmistakable. The missing piece of Julia Martha Thomas had surfaced at last. When the skull was brought into court, a gasp rippled through the gallery. One juror wept. Kate, staring at it from across the dock, went pale as chalk. For a moment, her lips moved, as if she were whispering to the dead. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty. There was no question, no mercy, no doubt. When the judge pronounced the sentence of death, Kate Webster merely bowed her head. Her final words to the court were almost inaudible. The river wouldn't keep her. It brought her back to me. She was taken to Wandsworth Prison to await execution. There, under the dim gaslight, she oscillated between repentance and rage. One day she prayed aloud. Another she cursed the gods. But always, she refused to explain why. Until the night before her hanging. The chaplain visited her cell. She asked for paper and wrote a final confession. In it, she admitted what everyone already knew, that she had killed Julia Thomas not by accident, but in cold blood. She confessed to luring her employer into the kitchen, striking her down, and destroying the body to conceal the evidence. But there was one last, chilling detail she added in her own hand. She wrote that, when she tried to dispose of the head, she could not make herself throw it into the fire. It looked at me, she wrote, like it still knew. When she finally hurled it into the night, she said she heard it hit the ground with a hollow sound and roll toward the river. The following morning, July 29th, 1879, Kate Webster was hanged at Wandsworth Prison. Outside, crowds gathered again, silent this time. The bell tolled once, and somewhere along the Thames, the water moved softly against the stones, as if exhaling the last of a long-held secret. After the execution of Kate Webster, the case of Julia Martha Thomas seemed to fade, at least officially, into the fog of Victorian London's darker history. The newspapers moved on to fresher horrors. The crowds dispersed. Vine Cottages, once the scene of unthinkable violence, was left to decay quietly under the creeping ivy and soot. Yet, for those who lived nearby, the memory of what had happened there would not go away. Children dared one another to run past the house at night. Neighbors swore they heard sounds. Footsteps, soft sobbing, the faint clatter of crockery from a kitchen long cold. For decades, no tenant lasted more than a few months. They said the house felt wrong, as though the walls themselves retained the memory of what had been done inside. The stains on the floorboards, no matter how often they were scrubbed, seemed to reappear. And some nights, when the wind came off the river, people claimed they could smell something sharp, metallic, and burnt, like a whisper of smoke that never quite left. Vine Cottages eventually fell into ruin. By the early 1900s, it was demolished, replaced by new brick homes built for a growing London suburb. The new residents of Richmond spoke of progress and civility, but the legend of the Richmond murderers endured in quiet conversations and the occasional ghost story told to frighten children. Time moved on. A century passed, and then the river spoke again. It was October of 2010, 131 years after Julia Martha Thomas was killed. A group of builders were renovating a house near Richmond, along the same road where Vine Cottages had once stood. The property belonged to an actress, unsuspecting of the history buried beneath her garden. The workers were digging the foundation for a new extension when one of them struck something hard, something that didn't sound like stone. He crouched, brushed away the soil, and froze. A human skull stared back at him. At first, the police suspected it might be ancient, perhaps centuries old. Richmond, after all, had deep roots in history. But when forensic experts examined the skull, they made a startling discovery. The bone structure matched that of a middle-aged woman, dating to the late 19th century. The damage to the neck vertebrae was consistent with violent separation. Then came the detail that turned a curious find into something far darker. The precise location of the discovery, mere feet from where Vine Cottages had once stood. DNA testing soon confirmed what historians and criminologists had long speculated but never proven. The skull belonged to Julia Martha Thomas, the widow murdered by her servant in 1879. For the first time in more than a century, her remains were complete. News outlets around the world reported it with eerie fascination. Head of Victorian murder victim found in Richmond Garden. The headlines read, "The house where it was discovered belonged, by coincidence, to actress Amelia Fox, a woman who years earlier had narrated a television documentary about the very same case. Fact and fiction had collided. The circle had closed. When the skull was reburied later that year, the service was small, quiet, almost forgotten. But those who attended said there was a strange stillness in the air, as if the earth itself exhaled after holding a secret for so long. And yet, some secrets never sleep. The modern residents of Richmond speak rarely of Vine Cottages, but those who walk the lane late at night say they still feel a presence near where the old house once stood. A sudden drop in temperature, the faint smell of burning tallow, the sound, barely audible, of someone washing dishes, over and over again. One man, a night watchman for a nearby construction site, reported seeing a figure by the river one foggy morning in 2012. A woman in black, he said. She was standing on the embankment, holding something like a bundle. I called out, thinking she was in trouble. But when I got closer, there was no one there. Just footprints in the mud, leading straight to the water. He swore the footprints stopped at the edge. No return tracks. The Thames has changed since the days of Kate Webster. Its banks reshaped, its waters dredged and tamed. But the river remembers. It carries everything that is given to it. Every confession, every crime, every whisper that London would rather forget. And in Richmond, that memory runs deep. Historians still debate Kate's motives. Some say it was greed, others resentment. But those who have studied her case in detail speak of something more primal, an act that seemed to come not from circumstance, but from a darkness that already lived within her. A darkness that could hide behind civility, mimic gentility, and then, without warning, turn feral. That was the true horror of the Richmond case. It wasn't only the murder or the dismemberment, it was the illusion, the idea that evil could live in an ordinary house, behind lace curtains and polite conversation. Julia Martha Thomas was buried properly at last, her skull reunited with what was left of her body. But the story of Vine Cottages endures like a quiet warning, that even in a city built on progress and respectability, the past is never truly buried. On certain nights, when the fog drifts low across the Thames, people say they can see a faint glow in the mist near the old river stairs, a lantern's light swaying slowly, back and forth. Some say it's the ghost of Julia Thomas, searching for the pieces of herself that were scattered and lost. Others believe it's Kate Webster, condemned to wander the banks forever, clutching a bag that grows heavier with each passing year. But perhaps it's neither. Perhaps it's only the river itself, holding the memory of what happened there, reflecting it back in fragments to anyone who dares to look too closely. And if you ever walk that way, late at night, you might notice something odd. A faint smell. Not quite smoke. Not quite perfume. The sense that someone is watching from a window that no longer exists. Because though the house is gone, the story remains. And the story, like the river, never stops moving. So lock your doors. Keep the lights low. Because after tonight, you'll never look at the quiet streets of Richmond the same way again.